Hi again, it's Nick Mays, and welcome to Lecture 3. In this series so far, we've defined history and modernity, and we have seen that the world has truly changed. That is to say, if you compare the world of 100 years ago to the world of today, you will see that it has changed, our world has changed in every possible respect, from a material point of view, from a technological point of view, from a human rights point of view, etc. In today's lecture, I would like to try and make sense of the past. All right, today we're going to be talking about judging the past, whether we can judge the past, when we can judge the past, and why we would want to do so. So just imagine the following. It's the year 2033. It is the anniversary of Hitler's coming to power, and books have come out commemorating this event, new biographies. So imagine a new biography of Hitler in which the author has been absolutely honest, describes everything, the Gestapo, the concentration camps, Operation Barbarossa, the massacre of people, the starvation of all sorts of individuals, etc., etc. Just all the horrors of Nazism are on display. But she doesn't stop her narrative there. She goes on to describe the post-war world, one in which Europe is finally at peace. It becomes unified through the European Union. Nazism is put to one pass. The Germans easily manage to bring themselves back to a civilized stance. We have social programs and so on and so forth. Imagine if she reached the conclusion, therefore, that given the outcome within Europe after Hitler's coming to power, given that the outcome was so positive, perhaps the war itself wasn't such a bad thing. We would find that very peculiar, to say the least. All right, imagine there's a second biography, again written on the 100th anniversary of Hitler coming to power, and once again the author does the same thing, describes Nazism with consummate honesty, all the warts, and then describes the post-war world, in which, of course, yes, there's the European Union and there's our technology, etc., etc. But at the same time, there's also social disaffection because of our social media. There's more homelessness, there's more alienation, and so on and so forth. And she reaches a very different conclusion. She says that in a sense, this war, this world that has come about because of the war is awful. And she compares it adversely to the war before, the state of the world before the onset of Hitler, and feels that this war was not only ugly in its own right, Nazism was ugly in its own right, but that the aftermath it gave birth to was also exceedingly ugly. That too would strike us as very strange. Then imagine there's a third biography to come along. And some of the sample quotes would be along the lines of, through the use of the Reichstag Emergency Decree and the Enabling Act that followed shortly after, Hitler came to control all governmental processes. Or, external conditions in Europe impelled the German leader to take his country to war. Or, let me not block the text here, through the course of 12 years of Nazi policy, 6 million Jews died throughout Europe. Again, in this case, the author writing this commemorative biography is consummately honest, but at the same time is scrupulous to avoid any type of judgmental language whatsoever, so that Hitler comes to power through what this author is going to allow us to infer were either legitimate or illegitimate means, or Hitler actually brought about the war through conditions that were either legitimate or illegitimate. The author will leave it to us to decide this. Or she'll describe Nazi policy, how Jews were deported and sent to Auschwitz, etc., etc., but she will not use the word genocide or murder because she wants us to infer this. She wants to maintain a certain neutral, objective stance. I think this too would strike us as very strange. And all of these give rise to a very interesting question. How are we to judge the past? I think any normal Westerner or any normal human being today would look at Adolf Hitler and would say, this was not a very nice man. This man is a demon of history. And yet strange to say, if we speak about Attila the Hun, right, well, Attila the Hun has really become kitsch. Right? His figure is on this t-shirt here, he himself was quite a dangerous, unstable, genocidal individual. And yet for some odd reason, this is a man whom this woman in the picture wouldn't hesitate to put on her t-shirt, whereas she would by no means want to do this with Adolf Hitler. It's a very peculiar, very, very peculiar thing that one character who no longer exists is being judged adversely, and the other character who no longer exists is not being judged with nearly the same degree of harshness. Why is that? How do we judge the past? What on earth are we to infer from the past? Can we judge the past? Is it possible to do so? I mean, when we actually take a look at this picture once again, we saw it at the very start of these lectures, the famous Starbucks scene in Game of Thrones. There it is in the top right corner. It's not, imagine if we said, well, it's not just that the Starbucks cup intruded on the set. Imagine if we said, well, why doesn't the Game of Thrones world have manufacturing? Why couldn't they produce plastic? Why on earth don't they have equal rights between men and women? Why is it that they are using this ridiculous type of, armor and weaponry instead of having guns and Sherman tanks or the like, as normal people would? We would say you're missing the point here. Right? That's why this is so anachronistic. We're allowing the Starbucks cup and all its implications to intrude on a world where it simply doesn't belong. And is that true of the past in general? In other words, is it possible that when we judge the past in any set of circumstances, we're acting in a presentist vein? We are taking our values and we're projecting them onto a distant period, and it simply is a vainglorious exercise. So, for example, just imagine if you're really interested in ancient Greece or any early period before the feminist revolution came about, and you have feminist historians judging these periods according to the standard as to whether or not women were treated well or not, whether they had equal rights, whether they could vote. So imagine reading a history of ancient Athens, and the scholar is saying this was a pretend democracy. They weren't nearly as great as you think they were because women couldn't vote. As we saw in an earlier lecture, women couldn't vote until a certain societal state had developed, and therefore perhaps that type of intrusion, presentist intrusion, the attitudes of today onto this ancient context are unseemly. Or imagine a history of the world, all periods, in which the author is in a sense taking populations to task if they weren't aware of the divinity of Jesus. That in a sense, all of the historical process was supposed to lead to an awareness of Jesus. And if you weren't aware of Jesus in your lifetime, then somehow you're not part of true civilization. That too would strike us as very tiresome and presentist as well. Or other histories might view things from an imperial perspective, where in a sense, if you're not part of this gradual unfolding of civilization as understood from a distinctly Western perspective, you might be telling a history in accordance with this rather unpleasant illustration we see here, where you have Uncle Sam representing the United States, of course, and John Bull representing England, carrying these different caricatured populations towards the heights of civilization, bypassing, of course, all the sins that these populations suffer from. If you were to write a history of China or Japan or of different African states in this vein, we would find it distinctly tiresome because once again, it would be seen through a very, very narrow presentist focus. On the other hand, before we leap to the conclusion that there should be no judgment of the past because it will always be an exercise in presentism, what if we take that objective stance as the author of our pretend biography 3 of Hitler does, where you survey the past and you're not willing to make any judgment whatsoever. Everything is just really a statement of fact without any type of condemnation whatsoever. Are we going to give all systems a free pass? Ancient slavery together with US slavery, the Roman Empire together with the British Empire? Or do we feel that some circumstances merit judgment and other circumstances don't? After all, if we don't judge the past, in certain circumstances at least, I know that in the case of my history students, they would feel that I was somehow sweeping something under the rug. They would feel, you don't want to talk about a certain period in American history or Canadian history or modern Western history with any type of judgment being brought to bear, because you're somewhat ashamed of it and you think we'll be ashamed of it, and therefore you're sweeping it under the carpet. Don't talk about it so that we can see ourselves in this perfect light. So obviously, if you don't judge, you're going to be dealing with that type of suspicion on the part of a contemporary generation that is very much aware of the fact that our past has some very unseemly chapters. At the same time, you're not going to be able to explain how we got from there to today. That is to say, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We don't have slavery in the United States today, thank goodness. And as I've argued already, I don't think racism is nearly as pointed a force as it was 50, 60 years ago. We've come a long way. Well, how did we come a long way? It could be that if we refuse to judge past chapters, we will never understand our own evolution. So for these two reasons, I think it's fundamental that we get the judgment recipe right. Whether we can judge, when we can judge, and why we would judge. Otherwise, once again, how is it that the United States at one time had a slave market, and 150 years later, there's actually a black man who was at the helm of state? Fascinating story, and judgment, perhaps, our capacity to judge, the allowance we give ourselves to judge, might actually go some way in explaining how this turn of events came about. Or the same could be true of the British Empire. At one time, it controlled a large part of the earth, and today it's essentially reduced to the country that it started as some 300 years ago. How did that come about? If we say we can't judge this particular entity, for the various unseemly acts it did, or for the great things it did, either one, well, we might simply be burying beneath the ground any notion of how we actually had this evolution from its former state to its present day one. So why judge? We judge so that we can learn from our best practices. We judge so that we can put our worst practices to one side. And I think most importantly, we understand how we evolved, how we came to embrace this modern consciousness, this modern state of mind that I think, generally speaking, overall is infinitely more just and more sound than the state of mind that we left behind. So for these reasons, judgment is actually quite a necessary exercise. So how do we judge? What are the parameters? The method that I've picked up on in recent days from my history students is the question, could they have known better? Could the population back then have known better when it came to the very practices that they were doing? Was there some type of template in place that would have advised them their behavior was unsound? So perhaps one way of explaining this is to turn to this famous passage in the Torah or the Old Testament in which Abraham entertains these three angels who have come to visit him. He's a very hospitable host, and he immediately runs out to them and he washes their feet and he serves them food. He serves them, in fact, milk and meat together. Now, from a contemporary Jewish perspective, if you're Orthodox, that is a severe no-no. Right? You cannot mix meat and milk together. So how is it that Abraham, who is the patriarchal figure of the gods, of the Jews, is getting this so horribly wrong? Well, the fact of the matter is that the Torah has not yet been revealed to his generation. That will only come quite a bit later with the figure of Moshe. And therefore, the argument with respect to Orthodox people is, how would he know to serve these people one dish of meat separate from a dish of milk if the template that determines whether this is right or wrong isn't in existence yet? So therefore, you can't judge him in this regard. And that, I think, is a very, very useful standard we can apply when it comes to determining actions in the past. In other words, in order to put the bad guys away and to judge people of having acted in an unseemly or violent or unlawful fashion, the law first has to exist. It's a fundamental condition. And if the law exists, and it isn't being followed by certain actors, but nonetheless you have agents who are aware of this law and are telling the population as a whole, there is a better way to act. You're not doing it now, but you really should be doing it now. And down the road, let's hope we're doing it according to this template. Well, under those circumstances, perhaps we'll have an idea of how people eventually abandoned their unseemly actions and came to act better. So this idea that they could have known better eventually turns into, with over time and with the right agents in play who are gradually listened to and who reach a critical mass, they could have known better turns into they do know better. And they could have done better, right, turns into they do better. Right? So all of a sudden we have some idea of why we should judge and how we move from from back then to nowadays. But as a way of illustrating this more forcefully, why don't we examine conditions in which judgment is unseemly, and yet we're doing it today, right? Where we are behaving in what I feel is a presentist vein, and then instances in which it is clearly not unseemly to judge, in which that whole charge of presentism is really essentially null and void. Right? Because once again, this is going to be the light that leads us on. This is the light that will call upon our better angels, lead to an enhanced state of consciousness in which we're aware of wrongdoing, and it will make the world a better place. All right, so one example where it is presentist to judge the past involves the following academic at Princeton University, one Dr. Peralta. Dr. Peralta is really quite an amazing figure because he started out his youth on Santo Domingo. He made his way in exceptional poverty. There was a great deal of racism in Santo Domingo then if you were black, as Dr. Peralta was. He came to the United States as an undocumented immigrant. He tells a story in the book, Undocumented. And because he was a very, very bright character, his smarts were picked up on. Gradually, his unlawful status was sorted out. He was granted various funding to study classics at Berkeley and Princeton and Oxford. And eventually he ended up as a professor of Roman history at Princeton University today, where he now has tenure. Right. So what makes this character so interesting is that ultimately he feels that this field of specialization that he has become a master of should really be scrapped. It is a terrible, terrible branch of study. And it has been responsible for the invention of whiteness, or at very least, the perpetuation of whiteness. He feels that when you look at classical studies, the writings of Thucydides and Homer and Julius Caesar and so on and so forth, it has given rise to movements like fascism. What you see there is a symbol that Mussolini, it's on the left, Mussolini used the Roman fasces, which was a symbol of the Roman consuls back in Republican days. He used that as a symbol of his own fascist movement. And the symbol itself, it essentially speaks for itself. It consists of a bundle of rods, which meant the consul in Republican days had the right to beat anyone without any interference, and the axe means he had the right to execute anyone without interference. And Mussolini thought that this was, in a sense, a pretty good symbol of the type of authority he should exercise as a fascist leader. So we see that fascism was influenced by classics. There's a direct line between the two of them. There was also a direct line between slavery and classics. Aristotle, the figure on the right, he exposited in his Politics this idea that slaves, in a sense, are slaves by nature. If you end up a slave, it is because there's something wrong with your character, or you have this inborn, innate quality that, in a sense, is pushing you in the direction of becoming a slave. This is tied in with a much, much larger set of theories that Aristotle has come about with, but you can easily understand why this would strike many people today as thoroughly obnoxious. And Aristotle was responsible for it. And then the question is, how many people, let's say in the US South, who no doubt read Greek, some of them did at least, how many of them actually read Aristotle, this extraordinary authority, and felt that his writings in the Politics actually justified the policy of slavery? It could be that when people were talking about dismantling this peculiar and very ugly institution, well, Aristotle always stood in the way. And from that perspective, well, perhaps this field of studies is really quite a terrible one. As Peralta himself says, If one were intentionally to design a discipline whose institutional organs and gatekeeping protocols were explicitly aimed at disavowing the legitimate status of scholars of color, one could not do better than what classics has done. The field is equal parts vampire and cannibal. Far from being extrinsic to the study of Greco-Roman antiquity, the production of whiteness turns on closer examination to reside in the very marrow of classics. One can only conclude that classics has been instrumental to the invention of whiteness and its continued domination. These are very difficult words for any classical scholar to read because they're partly right. It is absolutely the case that classical studies has been there at very, very ugly moments in Western history. No doubt it was referred to at the time of the Reformation, at the time of the 30 Years' War, at the time of imperialism, at the time of the American Civil War, at the time of the First World War. Classics no doubt inspired people who were embarking on very questionable actions and caused them to behave at times, or gave them the feeling that they could behave with full sanction from this tradition in very unseemly fashions. It could be that concentration camp guards were reading Homer even as, at night, even as during the day, they were just butchering huge numbers of Jews. So perhaps Peralta is onto something, only I would say not so fast. Not so fast. It is absolutely true that we see unseemly aspects in the Greco-Roman world. In the case of the Greeks, they are constantly fighting. There's a great deal of misogyny. There is the treatment of the fact that they own slaves and they have slaves. There's at times an intense xenophobia. That word barbaros, right? It does denote anyone who's non-Greek, and at times if it's descriptive, but at times it's also deeply, deeply insulting. There's us, the civilized people, the Greeks, and there's everyone else. You could read the classics and come up with many instances in which you see things that would make your really just raise your hackles and make you think that this is a deeply uncivilized population. But the question is this true? Is this true of them in peculiar, or is this true of all ancient populations? If you turn to the Holy Bible, right? If you look at the Holy Bible, are there instances in which you have descriptions of very unseemly events? Absolutely, right? There are references to slavery. There is an acceptance of slavery, and more about ancient slavery in just a minute or two. There are descriptions of battles that are blood chilling. There is, in the book of Joshua, there is essentially the first genocide that takes place. It's not a pleasant fact. It's a very, very bitter world that the ancients were navigating. It's not peculiar to the Holy Bible. It's peculiar to just about any set of ancient texts that one would encounter. And at the same time, because the Holy Bible is so extraordinarily influential, it accompanied the conquistadores when they came to the New World and enslaved huge numbers of people. It accompanied the members of the Inquisition that were torturing heretics when they felt they weren't living up to the true standard of what it was to be a Catholic. They accompanied people who were fighting during the Reformation Wars, which killed approximately 25% of Central Europeans. Right? The Holy Bible would have given sanction to someone who felt that that simple host, right, was not a cracker, as it would be in the eyes of some people, and that was reason enough to run that person through with the sword. Right? It is stood opposed to abortion, to women's rights, to the emancipation of the black men, and so on and so forth, in the wrong hands, even as it has been a source of inspiration for people who wanted to free the black men, who wanted to give women their free dues, who wanted people to live a life of justice, who wanted to stand properly by natives who were being preyed upon by the conquistadors, and so on and so forth. Right? Because this is such an overarching tradition, as is true of classics, because it's been around for so long, it has been put to the use that an angel would approve of, and put to the use that a devil would approve of. In the hands of the right demagogue, in fact, I think you could take Jesus's Sermon on the Mount, and you could probably use it, if you were a very skilled rhetorician, you could use it to justify the creation of Auschwitz. It all depends on how you're going to emphasize this text, which is brilliant, right? It is full of wisdom. It is old and venerated, but that doesn't mean it can't be put to very, very troubling use by the wrong type of person. And if it's true of the Bible and the classical tradition, it's certainly true of the Quran as well. This text, which inspires hundreds of millions of people yearly, right, daily, right? It was also the source of inspiration for those hijackers who smashed the planes into the Twin Towers. It has been an inspiration for Arab slavers who operated with a free hand in Africa and were actually an instrumental part of the African slave trade. Now, in a way that, to some degree, is comparable to the type of terrible, terrible practices that took place in the US South. These Arab slavers were actually giving ancient slave traders a run for their money. Would we say, and then of course there are the various jihadists who have blown up cafes and have acted with despicable violence. ISIS would be a great example. All of them are deriving their principles from this text because the text itself is so overarching in reach. It is so distinguished, and it has inspired loving acts of kindness and generosity. It has created workable societies for people, but at the same time, in the wrong hands, because of its venerability, it can be put to deadly, deadly use. And therefore, if you're going to cherry pick and you're going to say, well, we don't like the use that classics has been put to, right, and therefore we should cancel it, would Peralta want to do the same thing with the Holy Bible and with the Quran? I don't think so. I don't think so. And therefore, I'm not sure if this is really truly a great argument. At the same time, is he sure he wants to cancel this tradition, which, yes, was responsible for misogyny and no doubt in the case of Aristotle inspired slavery in the modern era, but at the same time there are brilliant, brilliant elements to it, absolutely brilliant elements. So you have Aristotle's Politics that speak of slavery, you have the misogynistic treatment of women, as you see in the bottom left-hand corner, where women are best off just doing the domestic work and not coming out into public. You have a character by the name of Cleon who is responsible for something known as the Mytilenean slaughter, or would have been if he had not been stopped. And then over here, you've got the character, the poet Simonides of Amorgos, who wrote this poem in which women are treated and described so maliciously. And really, it is very difficult for a modern author to read. You've got these blemishes, that goes without saying. But at the same time, probably the only open voice about homosexuality in the classical world, you have Plato's Symposium, or you've got the erotic poetry of Sappho, in which there is an open celebration of sexual acts and love, romantic love, between members of the same sex. Where else do you find this? If you were to expunge the classics, you would have to expunge, right, this exceptional treatment of a subject that is of vast importance to us today. You'd have to expunge it from the historical record. And surely it goes some way in balancing out who the Greeks were. Similarly, you have Euripides's Trojan Women. He staged this play. Everyone in Athens saw it in the wake of something known as the Melian disaster. What happened was the Athenians captured the island of Melos at a time when they were at war with Sparta. The people of Melos were aligned, they were allied with the Spartans, but they were willing not to fight against the Athenians, only they wouldn't fight on their side. And therefore the Athenians killed the men and sold the women into slavery. The very next year, Euripides, an Athenian playwright, stages a play called The Trojan Women, in which you have the women of Troy now being sent off into captivity after Troy has been destroyed, and they're weeping and lamenting, and it's clear to everyone in the audience that Euripides is telling the Athenians, what you did on Melos is wrong. It is absolutely wrong. A tradition that can allow for such criticism of a state is truly a remarkable tradition, in part at least. Then you have something known as the Parabasis. This is a part of an Athenian comedy where the head of the chorus takes off his costume, walks, everything stops, he walks, and now he addresses the population watching the play, which would be just about everyone in Athens. All citizens in Athens would actually be attending what we call political theater. And in his Parabasis, for the next 4 to 5 minutes, he would address the population saying, I strongly disagree with this policy, and the leaders of our state should actually do something to correct it. It is if someone in the United States or some modern states suddenly had a microphone with which he could address everyone living in the United States and tell them for 5 minutes precisely why a certain policy was wrong. And he could do it without recrimination and consequence from the governing authorities. Is there any ancient population that has this notion of self-criticism, right, available? I don't think so. And once again, that should give us pause in determining whether this culture should be canceled or not. And what about Plato's allegory of the cave in his Republic? Or Zeno's paradox, in which he shows, infuriatingly, that there is no motion? Or we have this whole idea of atoms. Can you imagine a world in which you have people asking, well, what does the world consist of? And just about every population is saying, well, whatever the world is, it was created by God. And then you have a man by the name of Democritus who comes along and he says, well, maybe not. Maybe if we divide objects in half, and then in half again, and then in half again, and in half, and in half, and in half, we eventually get to a particle that is indivisible. It is atomos, as the Greeks would call it. And that is what actually lies at the root of our physical world. This is brilliant. It's brilliant. There is no population that is speculating in such a fashion. And the question that someone like Peralta would have to ask himself is, do I want to end this tradition because of my presentist perspective? Right? And finally, what about the Antigone? Right? In the play The Antigone, you have the head of Athens, a man by the name of Creon, who is bullying a woman, Antigone, who is the most vulnerable member of the state because her father is dead and her two brothers are dead. In fact, they killed each other in a war. One brother was leading an army against Athens, the other brother was trying to defend Athens, and one kills the other in hand-to-hand combat. Right? So Antigone has no male relative to champion her cause before the public, before Creon. And unfortunately, Antigone, when an edict is published to the effect that no one on the opposing side can actually be buried, she goes out and buries her brother in spite of the fact that he led an army against Athens. She is discovered doing this, and now she's going to pay a price. Ultimately, the play is about the limits on power that the most powerful member of the state has with respect to the weakest member of the state. Right? In this play, Sophocles is telling us that in a city-state like Athens, it is wrong for someone who has all the cards, someone like Creon, to use those cards in such a heavy-handed fashion against the weakest member of society who has no support. And the really brilliant thing about this play is that it's not as though Sophocles was mentioning this as a theory to the Athenians who were watching, and as you can see in that depiction of a play, everyone was listening to this play. He wasn't telling them this is how we ought to behave. He was telling them this is how we do behave. We have a state, unlike other states, where the very, very powerful cannot victimize the lowest common denominator. An extraordinary, extraordinary perspective, right, that existed in the ancient world. And I really don't think that one would necessarily want to cancel this purely because someone like an Aristotle wrote in an obnoxious vein in a very small fragment of his writings, and that fragment was put to irresponsible use by later characters. All right, so this classical antiquity would be an example where this notion of presentism is far off the mark. Another example, right, where in a sense, if you're criticizing it as Peralta does, you're introducing a Starbucks cup to the scene. Another example of this would be ancient slavery. If you turn to just about any single ancient population that I can think of, all of them had slaves. To some degree, you were faced with three decisions when you attacked a neighbor in the event that hostilities broke out. You could either, if you were in a position of victory, you could either slaughter that neighbor to a man, you could let them off the hook and say, don't do it again next time, mind your manners. But of course, they might do it again, and next time the shoe would be on the other foot. Or you could enslave them. And very often in a world that was bare subsistence level, where everything had to be made by muscle, either animal muscle or human muscle, very often that alternative of enslaving a population was the one that populations chose for themselves. Babylonians, Elamites, Sumerians, Greeks, Romans, Jews, right? and so on and so forth. Just vast numbers of ancient populations, Egyptians, right? Early African populations, all of them practiced slavery almost without exception. Same was true out east, China, Mongolia, Japan. Same was true in the New World, the Incans, the Aztecs, right? Various indigenous tribes, all of them practiced slavery, all of them, right? There might be one or two exceptions, but generally speaking, this was the common practice. The Old Testament, right? This is a guide to sound behavior, and yet what does it tell us in Exodus 21? When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, but in the 7th he shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her masters, and so on and so forth. In other words, they're trying to come up with the proper way to handle slavery. They're trying to bring about some type of a set of parameters in which slaves are treated with some degree of humanity. But the overall assumption here is slavery exists and we can't imagine a world without it. What would our economy look like? The Old Testament, right? This text which has inspired the best aspects of our nature, right? On which we have our roots, our moral roots founded, or so we assume, right? It actually speaks of slavery in this approving fashion. And it's not just the Old Testament, you see the same thing in the New Testament. In Ephesians we read, slaves, be obedient to your human masters with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart, as to Christ. Or, all who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name in our teaching may not be slandered. Those who have believing masters should not show them disrespect just because they are fellow believers. Instead, they should serve them even better. In other words, if you're owned by a Christian, don't think that he's under any obligation, moral obligation, to set you free. This is an economic arrangement which the world economy of that age very much depended on. There is no one in this world who is saying, wouldn't it be nice if we could free slaves? The Quran as well. O prophet, we have made lawful to thee thy wives, to whom thou hast paid their dowers, and those slaves whom thy right hand possesses out of the prisoners of war, whom Allah has assigned to thee. Or Allah sets forth the parable of two men, one a slave under the dominion of another. He has no power of any source, and the other a man on whom we have bestowed goodly favors from ourselves, and he spends thereof freely, privately and publicly. Are the two equal? By no means. Again, there is this attempt to assess how slavery should operate, because of course an institution of this nature, like any institution, human institution, is going to be highly complex and is going to involve many different types of circumstances. And the voice behind these texts is saying, how can we bring about the best possible arrangement with respect to this institution that is absolutely foundational to the way we think, the way we live, the way we spend, the way we create, the way we work, and so on and so forth. When you think, let's just pause here on Roman slavery. And the emphasis here is that Roman slavery is nothing like US slavery. In the first case, Roman slavery was not based on the notion of race. It was based on the notion of circumstance. You could be born into slavery, tough luck. You could be captured as a prisoner of war, tough luck. You could end up in slavery through debt. You could use your own person as collateral, and if you couldn't pay off the debt, tough luck, you're now a slave. Right? Very, very different from this notion that if you were black in the United States, then you belong to a servile caste. Right? At the same time, you could leave slavery. For example, in the case of Sejanus, who became the right-hand man of Tiberius, he was a slave. He worked his way from servitude to freedom and ended up highly, highly influential. Or the Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who also was a slave and won his freedom and eventually was the founder of the Stoic philosophy. Or this character over here, Terence, one of the most popular playwrights of the ancient world. He was a slave. He was able to win his freedom. He was able to, make use of his skills and eventually became a prime voice for the Roman perspective. Right? Fascinating how you could actually make these transitions with nothing held against you. And if you did win your freedom, which didn't always happen, there were plenty of people who died in miserable circumstances. This isn't This isn't in any way to say that slavery was a desirable state, quite the contrary. I'm just saying it's a very, very different type of state from its later manifestation in the United States. That would be one example. And what we should understand is that you could leave these circumstances behind, these slavish circumstances behind, and you could become a citizen and actually vote. Right? You could become almost a member, normal member of society, no hard feelings. What's so interesting, it's not a question though really of asking ourselves, was Roman slavery better than US slavery or not? What were the pros and cons to Roman slavery? The real point is, was there any Roman critic who could have pointed out to the Roman population as a whole, slavery is wrong? Not one. Perhaps there are a few ambiguous statements made within the Stoic philosophy, but otherwise, people thought that this was a normal practice. They didn't want to become slaves. They could pity the servitude of slaves, but at the same time, they would own them, and they couldn't imagine a world in which Rome was freed of its slavish population, as was true of every ancient population back then. In the case of Spartacus, played by the dashing Kirk Douglas here, there is, unlike the play, unlike the movie, in which we, the viewer, is supposed to be enamored with Spartacus and is supposed to see him in a highly sympathetic light because we're viewing things from our 20th century perspective, right? Our 21st century perspective. In actual fact, both the novel and the screenplay were written by dedicated communists, right? Spartacus is presented in a highly flattering light. I am Spartacus, everyone is saying at the end of the film. If you had shown that to a Roman, they would have said, this man tried to destabilize our economy, our peace. He tried to bring our entire society to a standstill. And the only people who would have admired him were slaves as desperate as himself. There would not have been a single voice who would have thought, this man has any moral lesson to teach us. All right. So much for slavery. It is, and once again, it is a seriously bad mistake to think that we can actually look at the past and judge ancient slavery as this infernal institution with the same degree of horror that we would bring to the table if we were judging US slavery, and more about that in just a minute, because that is an unduly presentist position to take. The same would be true of empire. Right? There are huge numbers of empires. Once again, the Hurrian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Sumerian Empire, the Greek Empire, and so on and so forth. The one that really, really puts people's hackles up is the Roman Empire. Right? Very often when we look at the Roman Empire, we think of this as, to some degree, a failed enterprise. And once again, I think that is acting in an unduly presentist vein. To be sure, one could make a pro column and a con column. One could say that it was awful because you had patrician rule, you had corruption, you had gladiatorial combat, you had capital punishment, you had slavery, and so on and so forth, conquest of populations that involved huge, huge casualties. It's estimated that Julius Caesar, in claiming Gaul for Rome, probably killed anywhere between 1 to 3 million people. Right? This is ugly, to be sure. But on the pro column, you've got that famous skit in Monty Python's The Life of Brian, in which these Jewish activists who want to throw the Romans out of Judea, they're just saying, what have the Romans ever done for us? And then, of course, they agree with, yes, well, the sanitation was okay, and the education was okay, and the road system was okay, and the defense is okay, and their laws aren't really all that bad, and so on and so forth. Very, very comic scene. And you could take this pro and this con approach and weigh them against each other, and eventually decide either that the Roman empire was above criticism or it wasn't above criticism. But a much more pointed way to do this, once again, was simply to ask, could they have known better? Was there any critic living in the days of the Roman Empire who thought the Roman Empire was a really bad idea? There are critics of the Roman way of life. Virgil, for example, in his Aeneid, he insinuates that the violence that will be an actual, will be an endemic aspect of Rome's rule, that this violence is going to lead to the destruction of very, very good characters, such as Turnus at the hands of Aeneas, who in a sense is the founder of this empire. The noble Turnus is killed by Aeneas in the same way that Romulus is going to kill his brother Remus when he actually founds the direct city of Rome. These are instances in which the message of Rome, the glory of Rome, is going to come at a huge cost, not just to distant populations, but to your nearest and dearest, and not just to enemies and miscreants, but to some of the noblest people around. That was a criticism that was in circulation. Tacitus, the historian, compares unfavorably Germans with Romans. He feels Romans have in a sense lost some of the sterling qualities that Germans brought to the table. And Juvenal, the satirist, looks at Rome and he thinks of it as a moral cesspit. He can't say enough in condemnation of the excesses of Rome, the consumerism, the ugliness in competing for large villas and the type of clothing you wear and the food, the orgies that you host and so on and so forth. But none of these critics, there isn't a single critic who would say the empire was a bad idea. If you were to go back into the past and you were to ask Romans, do you think your empire is a good idea? They would say, what are you talking about? And at what point should we have stopped growing? Should we have remained a small city-state? Should we have perhaps not joined or taken over the Latin League that at one point was turned against us? Should we have just left the Etruscans to one side when they conquered us for the longest time and just rolled with the blows? Should we have ignored the Carthaginians when they stormed into Sicily and we had to defend our borders? At what point should we have turned back from this notion of empire? There was no voice telling them that they could have known better with respect to the issue of empire, and therefore I think it is unsound to judge them. I think the reason why we do judge them, however, is that once again, following in the footsteps of Peralta, many critics understand that later proponents of empire, such as the British Empire and the French Empire, they very often use the model of the Roman Empire as an inspiration for their own colonizing and imperial objectives. And for this very reason, Rome comes under much greater and much more severe criticism as far as ancient populations go than other populations that established empires for themselves, Assyrians, Etruscans, Elamites, and so on and so forth. But it is a presentist exercise. This idea that empire makes no sense whatsoever, right? That it was wrong from start to finish. This would have fallen on deaf ears because there was no template in place to tell the Romans better. None of their neighbors would have been able to show them a better way of life. None of their neighbors would have been able to teach them how to be less misogynistic, less xenophobic, right, less racist, and so on and so forth. Right? It simply did not exist at this time, and therefore the exercise of criticism is hollow. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that our better angels can't steer us in a direction whereby we can criticize the past, as I said. And one such example would be the whole aspect of US slavery. This is very, very, very different from the model of slavery in the ancient world. The United States was born in the modern era. The United States is a very wide, rich, open space where there are very, very few people who would be there to attack it. It enjoys an abundance of mineral wealth and foods, the type of environment in which one would think slavery would not be at all necessary. At the same time, it only ended slavery in 1865, long after other European populations had decided that this really was an ugly institution. And even when it ended its slavery, it continued it until the Jim Crow era, right? Until the end of the Jim Crow era, 1964. Right? And this from the very first modern democracy, right? It's extraordinary documents, the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, right, together with a host of other stellar texts that tell us what true governance consists of, just governance consists of. The population that was responsible for this was still practicing this institution long after other Western populations had stopped. We the people, well, that people did not include Black people when this document was published in 1787. Right? And it's not as though Americans were short of critics, even at the onset of their own national identity. Early critics like Benjamin Lay, the abolitionist, or Benjamin Franklin, who was a Quaker and did at one time own slaves, but eventually freed them because he realized the institution was wrong. Or the Englishman Thomas Paine, who wrote Common Sense. These people, together with many others, were from the get-go telling Americans the institution of slavery is plain out and out wrong. And then at a later age, just closer to the time of the Civil War, you had Uncle Tom's Cabin that was read by everyone. This was readily available. And Stow's argument against slavery would have been known to everyone. She was a very persuasive writer and could essentially quote, line and verse from the Bible to tell you why this institution was utterly unsound, as well as bringing its sheer inhuman dimensions to bear, as was true of Weld's As It Is, history, slavery as it is. Here he just took down the various personal accounts of so many slaves and the suffering that they'd undergone, and published it, and it too was very widely read, so that once again there wasn't any person in America who could make the argument slaves like the way they're being treated. They wouldn't know what to do if they weren't slaves. This was utterly false, and everyone knew it was false. Even in the case of Lincoln's brilliant second inaugural, right? This is just as the war, this deadly war that has claimed over 600,000 American lives, is coming to an end. He says, "It may seem strange that any men should dare to ask a just God's assistance in wringing their bread from the sweat of other men's faces, but let us judge not that we be not judged." Okay, that sounds a little conciliatory, but he goes on to write just a moment later, "Yet if God wills that it continue, until all the wealth, that is the war, continue, until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." In other words, the cost that the Americans paid for this war, the death of over 600,000 men, right, in battle, white men primarily in battle, Lincoln is saying this is the cost that is necessary for the evil that we did. And he himself is coming to the table with an awareness of the evils of slavery, because he himself, from the time he was young, was very much aware of all the criticisms that were being launched against this ugly institution. But is that the end of the story? Are we supposed to say, so we can condemn the United States for slavery? Isn't the natural implication here, well, how did they actually end the institution, and how did they actually bring about, almost perfect equality between black and white in our own present day and age? And in other words, when Martin Luther King was giving his brilliant speeches at the time of the Civil Rights Movement, where was he drawing his values from? What was the source of his inspiration? Was he taking this from texts that weren't in circulation from the United States? Or was he drawing his inspiration from texts that had long been in circulation in the United States? Not only references from the Bible, but the political genius that an earlier generation of people had brought to the table, in spite of the fact that they themselves at times were slave owners. Was that his source of inspiration? Yes, it was. And it's important to understand this, because we realize that it is because of agents like Benjamin Lay and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and Beecher Stowe and a number of other crucial commentators at a time when slavery was in circulation. It's important to understand that we can judge because of their voices, but at the same time, it's important to understand that because those voices were present, right, the statement Americans could have known better turns into they do know better. And the statement that Americans could do better turns into the statement eventually they do better. Right? That is why judging the United States is so important. We have to recognize the wrong that was done, but we have to recognize the wrong that was done in a context where they could have known so much better because there were such voices around, and then we can understand how it was they actually ended this practice. It took way too long for them to do so, but they got there at the end of the day because of the very values that enable us to judge them today for having done something wrong back then. Oh, my apologies. What about empire? Notably, the British Empire. right? We can't judge ancient empires for the reasons I mentioned, but what about the British Empire, right? No, the one that the sun never set on until quite recently. Well, again, right, one could come up with a pro and con, set of tables, as often happens in English high schools today, right? This would be a very common source of debate. Was the British Empire overall, more beneficial than it was harsh and malevolent? And then, of course, you would make arguments such as, well, they ended this horrible practice of suti in India, a practice in which the widow of a man who died before the wife would be burned on the pyre with her husband, or the practice of thugi, this cult dedicated to Kali, the goddess of destruction, in which the devotees would just kill innocent wayfarers on the road as dedications to this goddess. They put an end to these things because they felt, well, this isn't quite cricket, and no doubt that's a good thing. One could speak of the Indian railroad system. Generally speaking, the map that you see today, that infrastructure was laid down by the British. The system that is used by hundreds of millions of Indians on a weekly basis is a system that British know-how gave rise to. So you could say, well, that's a pretty good thing. And you could say that India, the world's largest democracy, the fact that they actually appoint their leaders, well, that too is due to the British. So maybe they weren't as bad as we think they are. In fact, maybe they were better than they were worse. Except one could think of the Battle of Omdurman at the start of the 20th century, in which you had huge numbers of Africans mowed down by this small British expeditionary force. Or more pointedly, you could think of Amritsar, this slaughter of innocent Indians in the city of Amritsar, which at first the British tried to cover up, but eventually it became clear that this was truly appalling, right? In addition to legions and legions of instances of arrogance, of racism, of corruption, bad governance, deliberate starvation as a way of holding on to precious resources for one population as opposed to another, sheer naked exploitation, and a history of slavery that went on for 200 years. When you put things in the balance like this, you could be tempted to say, well, in spite of all the glaring weaknesses, perhaps it still was a better empire than it was a worse one. Right? Or you could reach the opposite conclusion, but I don't think that that is the sound method to bring to the table. Once again, we should ask ourselves, could they have known better? Even at the time of the American Revolution, you have Edmund Burke, a very prominent politician, writing as follows. With respect to this revolution, I do not know how to wish success to those whose victory is to separate from us a large and noble part of our empire. Still less do I wish success to injustice, oppression, and absurdity. Even then, you had vocal critics of King George III's operations to keep this up and coming population within the British fold. It was looked upon as unjust, needlessly violent, a waste of time, cruel, and so on and so forth. The same is true when you look at developments through the course of the Industrial Revolution, straight on through to the Boer War. Right? It was understood that the Industrial Revolution was desperately cruel to a certain sector of the British population, and you had homegrown critics who were saying as much. Jeremy Bentham, right, together with J.A. Hobson and the Fabians and so on and so forth. But even as they criticized the Industrial Revolution and its consequences back home, they truly understood that the same could be said of imperial practices overseas, where populations were being squeezed to feed the industrial ovens back in England. Or at the time of the Boer War, the British came up with this policy of the concentration camp. They couldn't quite distinguish non-combatants from combatants as they were trying to subdue this part of South Africa. So they separated the civilian population and put them in these internment camps, concentration camps they called them, where these people died by the score because the conditions were horrific. That too is such just a disastrous element in British policy, together with so many others. And you had homegrown critics who called attention to this very openly. Prominent people writing in prominent publications. In the wake of the Second World War, you had people like George Orwell, his famous short story, Shooting an Elephant, right, in which he's clearly condemning imperial rule overseas, or E.M. Forster in his brilliant novel A Passage to India, a very prominent author writing openly about the deficiencies of the English control of India, clearly a proponent of independence, Indian independence, writing openly for the British public, or Evelyn Waugh and his Vile Bodies, together with other novels, which again take a huge strip out of the English imperialists. With all these voices arguing against English imperialism, it's impossible to say that this system could not have known better. They could have known better, and they did know better, but they still stuck to practices that were really quite horrific. There is an operation known as Operation Legacy, where for 20 years the English in various colonial outposts were burning records because they understood if these records ever fell into the hands of the locals, the true elements, the true, disgraceful elements of imperial rule would come to light. They burned them because they knew better, but it didn't change their behavior. On the other hand, one does have to ask, how is it the empire fell apart? No doubt in part it is due to the fact that it was just too complicated to run any longer in the post-Second World War period. England was impoverished and it didn't have the troops, the money, or the inclination to maintain its imperial hold. But at the same time, one understands that the population itself realized the sheer impossibility of running empire from a moral perspective, not just an economic one. And it reached this conclusion through these agents who, through the course of several centuries, had been drawing upon homegrown values and using those values to tell Englishmen, their fellow Englishmen, this empire is unsound. And as that range of critics reached a critical mass, it finally got shoved home, this notion that empire has to be abandoned. And of course, this is a tribute to the values themselves, a democratic system that would enable people to publish these views, to speak their mind clearly of these views, right? The notion of freedom of speech, the notion of a wide range of debate, all of these are virtues that eventually caused these Englishmen to move from a point where they could have known better to a point where they did know better, and where they could have done better to a point where they did do better. And that's important to understand. Let's not let the British Empire off the hook for the terrible things it did, but at the same time, let us understand through our capacity to judge its terrible record, let us understand that that was the source of its salvation. That is what brought it into the light and allowed the better angels of its nature to prevail over the worse ones. In other words, when I discussed modernity, I discussed it as a state of mind or consciousness that embraces material gains, right? That embraces an unbounded openness to our material gains and our personal freedoms over as wide a distance as possible. And it's important to discuss this as a state of mind or consciousness, because today the idea of empire is unthinkable. That's what makes this such an interesting discussion. Today, in this modern period, this later modern period, the idea of one population calling the shots for another population and helping itself to its natural resources and the like, it is unthinkable in the way that it transpired even 100 years ago. We have moved, because of modernity, to a new way of seeing the world and our fellow human being within it. What about individuals? Why don't we move from the general and talk about individuals? How are we to judge Thomas Jefferson? Right? This is a man who clearly, right, was on the side of the angels at times. He wrote that slavery was an execrable commerce, a cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty. And he even goes on to say in the same text, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. The Almighty has no attribute which can side with us in such a contest, that is to say, on our side, in a war against the slaves. He would side with them. He is so clearly aware of his wrongdoing. He is also going to write those brilliant words in the Declaration of Independence about all men being born equal, right? He is also going to ensure that the Northwest Territory is going to remain. This was a territory that was possessed by Americans, but had not yet been turned into states. He made sure, right? He ensured that that territory would not be in any way tolerable for slavery, right? That was written into the Constitution too. On the other hand, on the other hand, he spoke very disparagingly of the black intellect. He felt that whites and blacks should not actually mix with each other. That didn't stop him from, having a long-term relationship with Miss Hemings, on whom he fathered multiple children. He, he perpetuated his own lifestyle through the means of slaves. He did not set these slaves free when he died. Right? He came up with the 3/5 clause in the Constitution. Right? All of these work very much to the disadvantage of the slave population, and suggest that on this topic of slavery, he was very much split. On the one hand, he hated it. I think that it wouldn't be overtly unsound to say that, but on the other hand, he realized that his own well-being depended upon it, and his own political smarts told him that there was no way this burgeoning republic could take birth if he was going to take a very strong stand against slavery and alienate states like North Carolina and South Carolina and his own Virginia, right, where the institution was still thoroughly rooted. At the same time, he made sure, at the time when the Constitution was being drawn up, that the Northwest Territory would remain slave-free. It was understood that some slaves, some states in the South would unquestionably have slaves in them, but not this territory here. At the same time, he unfortunately felt that blacks were the inferior of whites, and that the mixing of white and black was really unthinkable. Never mind, he had a long-standing relationship with Miss Hemings, on whom he fathered multiple children, and of course, he also depended on his livelihood for slaves, the slaves he owned, whom he did not emancipate on death. These are very, very low blows against the man, to be sure. He did not support the slave rebellion in Haiti. He brought in the 3/5 clause of the Constitution. But at the same time, we can't say, ironically, that he actually stood absolutely opposed to slavery, because he understood it was a wretched, unjust institution, which part of him was thinking will gradually, over time, actually be worked out of the American fabric. Now, not completely due to him by any stretch of the imagination, but partially through his doing. So when we think of Jefferson, should we think of him as the man who owned slaves but brought about democracy? Or should we think of him as the man who brought about democracy but owned multiple slaves? These are two very, very different statements, in which his sins in one instance are put way ahead of any virtue he brought to the table or any accomplishments he brought to the table. And the other one is one in which his accomplishments are paramount and his sins are pushed to one side. I don't think we can forget his sinning nature, the fact that he actually owned slaves. This is not something that one can sweep under the table or think of as in any way unimportant. It's fundamentally important, but at the same time, it is fundamentally important to understand that he was one of the architects of the system that would eventually push slavery to one side. His knowledge of how unjust slavery was, and in some instances his action on this knowledge, right, should be kept in mind when we try to understand how it was slavery was pushed to one side. If we want to understand, in other words, why it is that in a massively popular musical watched by millions of Americans, a black man actually plays Thomas Jefferson, this is ironically due to some of Jefferson's actions back then, when he was the owner of slaves. It's really quite a fascinating paradox, and it is the richness of this paradox that eventually allows us to understand how bad systems can eventually repair themselves. If we're just not satisfied with this explanation, we have to ask ourselves, well, who can escape history's judgment, if we are going to judge, without any blemishes attached to themselves? If you were going to talk about Richard Wagner, you'd have to talk about the use to which his music was played and his own detestation of Jews. In fact, everyone you see in this picture, from Shakespeare to Henry Ford to Voltaire to Hemingway to Martin Luther, right, and others, we understand all of these people were vocal anti-Semites, did not like Jews from top to bottom. So are we supposed to think that these people are irredeemably evil because of this? Are we supposed to think when we read Shakespeare, to be or not to be, once more unto the breach, dear friends, and so on and so forth? I don't have to listen to this guy because he is, just look at what he wrote in some of his anti-Semitic writings. Isn't that, in a sense, to rob the man of his due because of this important but sinning side that he was responsible for? The same is true of these characters you see here, right? Are we supposed to think first and foremost of John F. Kennedy, the man who brought women to the White House in droves and wasn't true to his marriage vows? Or are we supposed to think of the man who handled the Cuban Missile Crisis so brilliantly and perhaps saved the world from going up in a plume of smoke? Are we supposed to think, in the case of Martin Luther King, as this man who fought tirelessly for black rights with this golden tongue of his, bringing out oratory that one can still read to this day and still admire so openly? Or are we supposed to think of a man who also broke his marriage vows and at the same time wasn't terribly generous in his treatment of gays and lesbians? And the same could be said of Alexander Graham Bell, who was very much a eugenicist, right? He believed that weak people should be pushed to one side. The same would be true of Woodrow Wilson and his racism. Winston Churchill, the man, I shouldn't block poor Winston, the man who defeated Nazism, right? George Bernard Shaw, who gave Stalin a free pass in spite of his own plays in which he fights for social justice. Oppenheimer, a man who broke his marriage vows too, right? Brought about the bomb before Hitler got his hands on it and introduced us to the nuclear age. These people are in some sense sinning, but at the same time, their glory is just unparalleled to some degree. How are we to judge them? I understand debauchery. I understand human weakness. Everybody has human weakness. The element that is much more difficult to wrap one's head around is the brilliance of a Martin Luther King, the brilliance of a JFK, the brilliance of an Oppenheimer, the idealism of these different people. Those are mystifying elements. Their sins, that's just the common dross of humanity. And therefore, when we judge, we should judge very, very carefully. What about us? Down the road, as we move forward, do we want our children to remember us as the people who gave them this legacy of the internet and fair play and democracy and all the virtues that we take such pride in? Or will they condemn us because we ate our meat off the bone in a day and age where we now clone it, or it's a plant product? Will they condemn us for our puppy mills? Will they condemn us for our cancel culture, our willingness to expunge voices on the political landscape for reasons we hold to be unsound? If someone is voting in a certain way, or if someone is making an argument that some people would find sound, but we find rides up against our own sensibilities, and therefore we use our social media to ruthlessly grind this person into the dust, they might find that highly questionable on our part. They might find our attraction to lurid violence highly, highly questionable, right? Together with the homelessness within our midst. It could be that one day we're going to break, addiction, the terrible, terrible legacy of addiction and poverty and these other social ills. And in the age that, if we've actually developed the tools to do so and we've handed them to a later generation who can actually put them to good use, would it be fair that they turn to us and say, the tools you gave us are not good enough? We hold you responsible for the fact that you had these needy people in your midst and you didn't do enough for them. Or they could blame us for our consumerist ways, our wasteful ways when it comes to the disposal of plastics, and so on and so forth. Right? All of these are elements that they could judge us by, but wouldn't it be more true to the record if they saw the generosity with which we combated social ills? They saw the ingeniousness with which we cultivated people with talent who could push our technology forward. They saw the heartfulness with which we engaged in social discourse, and so on and so forth. Doesn't that count for something? If it does in our day and age, right, it does in previous ages where people had reason to know better and eventually came to know better. Is it also sound that one generation could pass such judgment on the past as Dr. Peralta would like to do? And I'm sorry to pick on him, but he is a very clear-cut example, as Dr. Peralta does with respect to the classics. Let's assume that he's right, and we should get rid of the classics, or we think he's right, and we do get rid of the classics? Is it right that one man living at one time should tell for all future populations, should determine for these future populations, you will never read Homer for yourself. You will never read Euripides for yourself. We will banish these people to the far aspects of our universe so that you never see the corrupting influence that these people brought to the table. And you won't see their gold either. Should any generation have this monopoly on what is sound and unsound, so that they deprive future generations from actually delving into these subjects on their own? I read classics, and I must say I was never tempted to regress from my own pro-feminist stand. I never was tempted to sacrifice animals. I was never tempted to engage in gladiatorial combat, and no one I was actually friends with at the time were either tempted in a similar fashion. And therefore I think our extreme presentism, which would actually denude this glorious tradition of any lessons it might teach us, would leave us more in the dark, right, than it would introduce light into our lives. And what about other populations that can know better? What about non-Western populations that have picked up on our technology and our banking habits and other aspects of Western society, and yet in the case of China, they still treat the Uyghurs in a desperately unfair fashion? They know better. They could know better today. If we don't judge properly in the case of not just the West, but other players that could know better, then there will be no social justice outside of the West. Why shouldn't we hold these people to account according to the very same standard that we apply to ourselves in our own past? In this present day, where we can actually say we know they know better because we are part of the modern body of critics who have presented their wrongdoing to them. An Assad in Syria and his vicious, vicious civil war, conducted with modern arms, modern technology, and modern support through finance and modern players. Right? North Korea and its toying with the atomic bomb. They have a perfect example in the population to the south on how they could conduct themselves better, yet they refuse to listen to it. And the same will be true of certain Middle Eastern regimes, or perhaps even Putin's Russia today. Not perhaps, definitely Putin today with respect to Ukraine. What if we are to say we don't want to judge based on they could have known better? It's not just that we deprive ourselves of an explanation as to how we evolved and actually did better. It means we're actually giving sinning modern partners who do know better today a free pass to continue in their wrongdoing. We are boxing ourselves in. All right, but truthfully, Peralta might be right in the end. Right? In the end, it could be that classics will fall by the wayside. Not for the reasons he supposes, not because it's so corrupt that it should fall beneath its own foundations, but instead because it has just become irrelevant. But I'll reserve that talk for our next lecture. All right, we have seen that we can judge the past on occasion, and that it is sometimes very useful to do so. When we get together next time, we shall examine the very significant losses that we have sustained.